Childbirth, a nerve-wracking time. Be grateful you weren't giving birth in the 1800s, where at some hospitals you had a 2 in 3 chance of surviving childbirth. And this depended on what the medical students were studying that day. Good hygiene practices are something that we take for granted and are second nature to us now. But in the 1800s, things were very different. Hand washing wasn't recognised as an essential thing to do, and microorganisms still weren't recognised as the cause of many diseases. Student doctors often went straight from autopsies to delivering babies in the maternity ward. This is the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1846 Vienna, as what would now be called a head resident of obstetrics, Semmelweis confronted the terrible reality of childbed fever. This disease struck postpartum women within 24 to 48 hours after giving birth and killed many women throughout Europe and America. In some maternity clinics through several decades, the mortality rate exceeded 20%. In some hospitals, over a period of weeks, epidemics of childbed fever killed 70% or more of all the women who gave birth. In Vienna, the mortality rate averaged a relatively benign 10%, but even at that comparatively low rate, more than 2,000 women died each year from the disease. All told, in 19th century Europe, childbed fever killed more than 1 million women. In May 1847, Semmelweis was struck by the realization that the diseased women in his clinic had all been infected by decaying remains of human tissues. Infection occurred because medical personnel did not wash their hands thoroughly after conducting autopsies in the morgue. He immediately began requiring everyone working in his clinic to wash in a chlorine solution. The mortality rate immediately fell to about 1%. Over the next 2 years, Semmelweis refined his understanding of childbed fever and accumulated impressive statistical evidence in support of his views. By 1850, he was convinced that every case of childbed fever was due to what he described as the resorption of decaying organic matter. While some of Semmelweis's contemporaries were willing to try chlorine washings, at the time everyone rejected his claim that every case of childbed fever was due to one universal necessary cause. The idea that every case of any disease would have a single universal cause was fundamentally inconsistent with existing medical beliefs, and even his teachers and supposed friends in the Vienna Medical School balked at this radical claim. Within 10 years, Semmelweis died after being beaten by the guards of an insane asylum to which he had been committed. By the time of his death, only a few physicians had accepted his account of childbed fever. However, in time his views prevailed. Within about 2 decades, several prominent researchers acknowledged that Semmelweis had helped provide a true understanding of childbed fever and, ultimately, of infectious diseases generally. Semmelweis's claims were starkly inconsistent with medical theories current in the 1850s. Understandably, this made his claims difficult to accept. However, by forcing physicians to abandon their cherished theories, his work led to the adoption of an entirely new way of thinking about disease. Thus, he did not simply contribute a beneficial new practice, rather he helped create an entirely new theory of disease. Preface. A 19th century medical student overheard a senior physician say that charity maternity clinics, birth houses as they were called, were really houses of death. He was surprised by the comment and asked a hospital worker why the physician would say such a thing. "It's obvious," the worker replied. The morgue is always full of corpses from the maternity wards, like fish on a slab. Medical advances are purchased by two kinds of sacrifice: the sacrifice of researchers trying to understand disease, and the sacrifice of patients who die or are killed in the process. One striking 19th century medical advance was the recognition that microorganisms cause disease. This particular advance was purchased in part by the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of young women who died following childbirth of a terrible disease known as childbed fever, a disease that was rampant in the charity maternity clinics of the early 19th century. In 1847, a young Hungarian obstetrician, Ignaz Semmelweis, discovered how the incidence of childbed fever could be significantly reduced. However, Semmelweis interpreted his discovery in a way that was inconsistent with contemporary medical doctrine, and his ideas were ridiculed and rejected by his fellow physicians. 18 years passed. Each year, while the doctors argued, thousands more women perished in maternity clinics throughout Europe. Then, at the age of 42, Semmelweis died in a Viennese insane asylum after having been severely beaten by the asylum guards. In the same year, an Austrian obstetrician named Karl Mayhofer published an essay in which he argued that childbed fever was invariably caused by microorganisms. This discovery, which was based partly on Semmelweis's work, was also rejected by many prominent obstetricians. However, a few physicians were persuaded by the evidence, and slowly the truth prevailed.